Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jeff Hewes. Thanks for watching. I've got another book review. All right, now I'm on the battlefield at Antietam, and I couldn't think of a more appropriate place for me to do this book review than on the battlefield at Antietam, because that is the subject, or at least George McClellan is the subject of the book I'm going to review here. Not necessarily exclusively about the Battle of Antietam, but obviously the Battle of Antietam is very integral to the history of George B. McClellan. And this book I'm going to do a review on is George B. McClellan, The Young Napoleon by Stephen W. Sears. Okay, now I have to tell you up front that I did not finish this book. I read 80% of this book. And the reason I did not finish reading this book is, oh my God, Stephen W. Sears despises George B. McClellan with every breath of his life. His disdain for George McClellan leaps off of every single page. Okay, now that's not the only problem I have with the book. Now, obviously, if you're biased against the subject matter of the book you're writing, your treatment of that subject matter is not going to be even. It's not going to be fair, especially when you're blinded from your bias, and that seems to be the case with Stephen W. Sears. Now, one of the main problems I have with this book was the way in which he uses sources. Okay, now, and the types of sources he used. Number one, the sources he used are 99% anti-George McClellan. Now, of course, George McClellan was a controversial figure. Okay, now, the reason he was a controversial figure initially was because he was a Democrat and he served in the Republican administration. So what that meant was, during his lifetime, during the time in which he was fighting the Civil War, all the Republicans in the political circles and in the media circles, newspaper circles, and within the army itself hated George McClellan. Okay, because he was a Democrat. Everybody, you think that right now, modern day is a very partisan time. Well, 1860 to 1865 was the most partisan period in American history, and Republicans did not like Democrats, and Democrats did not like Republicans. Okay, now also as a caveat, don't confuse today's politics with 1860s politics. Okay, I'm using the terms Republicans and Democrats only to define 1860 politics and how they affected the narrative of George McClellan and how they were used in this book right here. Okay, now, so basically the sources he uses are 99% anti-George McClellan, even though there are plenty of sources from the time period that are favorable to George McClellan. Okay, now, so that's one thing. He uses sources primarily, almost exclusively, that are negative to George B. McClellan. Okay, now, again, the way he uses those sources. Okay, now, of course, the Civil War was such a cataclysmic event in American history that all of the participants, 20, 25, 30 years later, were writing their accounts of what happened. Even up to 50 years after the battle, many of the participants were writing down their recollections and their stories. And many of these, obviously, were written from their own perspective, so everybody usually presents themselves in a positive light. Okay? Now, Stephen W. Sears, the way he treats George McClellan when he's writing about these events after the fact is that he just kind of dismisses it and says, well, he's trying to make himself look better, or he's just outright lying. Okay? Now, but Stephen W. Sears doesn't do this for the sources he uses against George McClellan. He pretty much takes those sources at face value, even though they're the same thing. They're a general writing 25, 30, 40 years afterwards, or they're a politician writing 25, 30 years afterwards, or they're a newspaperman writing 25. He takes their point of view at face value, but George McClellan, like I said, he doesn't use any other exonerating sources. He only uses anti. He uses either anti or he uses George McClellan. So there is a flaw in his approach to the sources he uses and how he uses those sources. Okay, now, another problem I had was he has hundreds of quotes from George McClellan's correspondence to his wife, which obviously didn't come out until decades after George McClellan died. And none of this was public during the time, but he doesn't put those those quotes in context. And again, he only uses negative quotes. He doesn't use positive quotes. In other words, there are quotes that George McClellan makes about Abraham Lincoln, and it's no secret that George McClellan and Abraham Lincoln had a rough relationship at best, and that they didn't like each other at worst. Stephen Sears uses the quotes that are negative by George McClellan to his wife about Abraham Lincoln, but he neglects to put in the quotes where George McClellan says kind things about Abraham Lincoln. Okay. Now he also fails to produce an overall context to those quotes as well. Number one, it's a husband venting to his wife. Okay, and most of the negative quotes come at periods of high stress for George McClellan. This is not it's not an even approach to George McClellan. Basically, Stephen Sears repeats the narrative that was set in place by the political opponents of George McClellan. He uses sources very poorly. He doesn't use exonerating sources. I don't recommend this book. I actually purchased this book over at the Antietam bookstore as well. Just like in the previous book review I just did. I don't recommend this. There are books out there that are much more even-handed. A guy named Hewes, or F-U-S, I can't remember the name, his first name. McClellan's War, that comes to mind. But this book right here is very biased. Stephen W. Sears despises, with every breath of his life, George B. McClellan, and I would not recommend this book. All right, well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, hit like. If you have any comments, please don't hesitate. Put those comments in the comments section. And I highly encourage you to rethink George McClellan. The history that has come down about him has been very biased. We're all familiar with fake history, fake news, and there's a lot of fake history about George McClellan that comes down. You don't have to become a George McClellan defender to recognize that there was a hatchet job done on him. Anyways, this is Just Hewes. Thank you for watching. Signing out.